Hello and welcome to Brief Encounters. Our guest today is Nupur Raut, a distinguished privacy lawyer, dual licensed in California and India. She earned her BA LLB from the National Law School of India University, NLSIU, Bangalore, and pursued her LLM at the University of Cambridge, specializing in international intellectual property law and data protection. Currently serving as Privacy Counsel at Demandbase, she has an extensive background in privacy law, AI governance, and appellate litigation at the Supreme Court of India. She's also certified artificial intelligence governance professional and an active member of organizations such as the IAPP and the Responsible AI Institute. With her expertise in data protection, privacy program management, and AI governance, Ma'am is shaping the evolving landscape of privacy law, and we are excited to explore her insights today. Hello and welcome to Brief Encounters. It is such an honor having you here.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here.
So, now this is a question that we ask all our guests, but before that, your journey in law began with an outstanding achievement, securing an All India rank of 8 in CLAT. So, firstly, how did law happen? Was it always meant to be, or was there a moment that solidified this decision? Or can you walk us through your preparation journey, and did you always envision yourself at NLS? Are you?
That's a lot of questions. So for the first part of it, no, I didn't always want to be a lawyer. I wanted to be a doctor because that's what my parents are. And I grew up thinking, no, I want to do exactly what they do. But along the way, somewhere I was very moved by the way the justice system works. I used to read the news a lot, basically. And I felt like I should do something to help. And the best way to do it, according to me, was to maybe take the UPSC exams or something, like be in a position to make a difference. And I spoke to a relative who was in the IAS, and he said, the most relevant career you can think of for civil servants is the law. You can be a civil servant no matter what degree you do, but the law is super cool. It's my daughter's also doing law. I have a cousin who's an AOR at the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow.
So following her footsteps, I decided, okay, I'm going to be a lawyer, but I'm going to be a civil servant.
No, lovely.
So, but that didn't work out. Like, as I went to law school, I was like, no, the law is interesting in itself. I don't have to do anything else. I don't want to do anything else. So that's essentially how I became a lawyer. I was like, I wanted to do something for other people and I wanted to be in like a position to help. But yeah, about my preparations. So no one in my family is a lawyer. We had no idea what to do. We spoke to some. I really thank my parents for this because they went out of their like usual networks to find people that have children who went to law schools, and they found out that this national law school system has like it has a lot of potential and it has a lot of opportunities, but you have to take this CLAT exam that's supposed to be really not difficult but exclusive, because the best schools only take like the first 300, 400 people or whatever. So I was enrolled in Career Launcher. I don't know what it's called now, but
it's Career Launcher, yeah.
Career Launcher for 2 years.
Wow.
And the first year I did not take it very seriously. I was just like, this doesn't seem to be that hard. This is whatever, like people are just, I wasn't in the groove. I opted to do the state level exams rather than IB or ISC or whatever else is,
Yeah.
or even CBSE's 11th, 12th, because it's comparatively easier for me as someone that has proficiency in English. I thought it's and science. I used to code as a child, so I thought, okay, I'll take science, HSC. HSC is what it's called in Maharashtra, and yeah, that became an integral part of my preparation because I didn't have to study so much. Yeah, so that way, I think in my like 12th standard, I got really serious because I realized the exam is it may not be as hard as the JEE, but it's how to say super exclusive in terms of the results that you get. So.
And there's no set pattern for the exam, in the sense anything could happen. They don't have a syllabus, they don't have something that's so set for it. It's just very random also.
It's not like a mathematical proof where,
Exactly.
there's one right answer, because and the GK is especially frightening because you don't know where it's going to come from.
Very
So I
true.
think that was what set the fear of God in me, that GK is, I'm just not going to be able to predict what's going to come in the exam.
Mhm.
So that's when I really seriously started preparing. And in terms of what I did to prepare, I focused on each subject individually. This is something I did on my own outside of Career Launcher. I focused on each subject individually for a month or so until maybe 6 months before the exam when I did practice papers. And I had a group of friends that I made along the way who were instrumental in getting me to the finish line. Yeah, so with their help and shared collections.
I love how humble you are about your journey. I mean, ranking 8th in the whole of the nation, that's crazy. That's amazing. So, congratulations for that also. No.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you to say, but I was shocked when the results came because I wasn't expecting this. I thought my paper was terrible and I almost just finished it. When the bell rang, I was just bubbling in my last answer and it's like, oh my God, I might get a 150 or something, which was pretty bad by the standards of the previous exam.
You guys had 200 questions, right? Now it's 120.
Yes, we had 200 questions.
In my year, it was 150. Now it's 120. So
That's
yeah,
interesting.
that's what they have kind of gotten a little easy. It's 2 hours, 120 questions.
I don't know about easy. There's negative marking still, though. No?
Yeah, that still exists. So your academic outstanding achievement did not stop here. You graduated top of class at NLSIU, earning gold medals for academic excellence. But at the same time, with balancing such rigorous academics, you had a bunch of extracurricular and co-curricular activities, such as the Literary and Debating Society, Social Legal Review, etc. Now, I understand that this would require immense focus and adaptability. How did you navigate your 5 years at law school? How did you balance both of these? And are they even important when it comes to, LLM applications or though life in general?
Oh, that's a loaded question again, and maybe it will take me like a book to answer, but let me give you the concise version of my response. So, navigating law school, as you know, wasn't the easiest thing in the world. It's hard for you to be in an environment where everyone is excellent in some way or the other, maybe academically, maybe in something else. And at least for me, I felt like I was pitting myself against everybody. Like I can't be as awesome as my classmates. So it took some conscious reflection to get over that feeling of like I'm not good enough. These people are so cool. And the way I did that was playing on my strengths in retrospect because I have a love for the languages. I love reading, writing. I love speaking also, evidently. That is also why I became a lawyer. So, yeah, I decided to enroll as a co-opt for the Literary and Debating Society. And the reason they took me was not because of my literary proficiency or anything, like, or the way I speak or anything. They were fascinated that I had once danced with, like, that is another long story professionally as a child. They were just like, oh, that's so cool. We want to know more about it. And that's how my interview went on. And they were like, oh, this person is really nice.
Oh my God.
So yeah, that's why I got my shot in at the Literary and Debating Society
That's exciting.
interview.
Now I want to know your journey about dancing. That's amazing.
That's really it. I used to dance like professionally as a child,
Wow.
when I was in school.
Wow.
Yeah, that's still a huge part of who I am. Like I just love dancing.
That's amazing.
So yeah, but then that was my inroads into the L&D, and that's where I stayed for 3 years, becoming the joint convener in 2 years' time. And honestly, navigating that with law school was very hard.
Yeah.
Because organizing brings its own set of responsibilities that don't necessarily accord with the things that you have to do as a student, obviously. I mean, I'm sure you know since you're organizing this podcast and you're a part of Project LLM, and I'm sure you do 1,000 other things as well. So it's not easy for anyone.
No, that's
But yeah, it taught me that multitasking is a very valuable skill in the world. Like you need to be able to manage your time such that you're able to allocate it to different things in a sustainable manner.
right.
Not always sustainable. It is possible. Burnout. There's so much, like you're also growing up at the same time. Those are your formative years. You're making friends, like let alone the sociological aspect of it. You're just like, I don't know, it's just a lot. So, but the fact that I liked the English language so much and I like organizing helped me stay on, like no matter what, for those 3 years. I also tried my hand at debating competitions and I went abroad, and I wasn't the best debater, but I enjoyed it. It was fun. And I liked the people I worked with. And it was similar for the socio-legal review. By the time I applied, I was in my third year, fourth year, I don't know, but I was done with my literary and debating society chapter, so it must be the fourth year. And again, I love languages, which is why I applied, and it was fairly easy to adapt to the kind of work that peer review requires, soliciting articles and things like that, because it was something that I liked, and that kind of helped me feel mentally balanced as well, because I'm doing something that I like in addition to the academics. So yeah, that's how I managed it. But in terms of how useful it is later for an LLM, I don't know that they cared if my I know I was a joint convener or what of the literary and debating society. What did I do? How many events did I organize? The social legal review carries a lot of weight because they know the kind of work, like it's a universally accepted phenomenon in these legal journals and like law school. So they know the kind of work involved, and I'm sure that played a role in at least my application being considered. I have no way to know, but for sure, I mean, having extracurriculars that resonate with people in other countries really helps you maybe even relate to people that you meet when you go abroad for a master's. So in that sense, yeah, it definitely helped. Like these extracurriculars were helpful.
That's great to know. And obviously, you learn how to balance a lot of things in life early on.
For sure, for sure.
Right. So if we move on to your LLM, which I mean, that is what the podcast is about, what inspired you to pursue an LLM, and was this decision clear from the outset?
So what inspired me to pursue an LLM? I felt like I wanted to study certain areas of the law in detail. That's kind of boring, but that's really why I wanted to do it, not because I wanted to work abroad or anything, which is a very good reason to do an LLM. I just felt like, I really want to know more about. At the time, I loved human rights law. I still do. IP law, which I still do. And I thought if I get the chance to go abroad and study it from a comparative perspective or a global perspective, that would be great. That's how the idea germinated in my head, because I thought, like, I had the aim of being in the workforce since day one, and I always thought I'm just going to leave everything and litigate the moment I graduate. But then I thought I won't get a chance to study anything further in depth if I'm already established in a career. And not to mention like other life things, like people want you to the personal commitments and things. So yeah, that's the reason I decided to do it. It's something that I just like wanted to learn. Like there's just certain things that I wanted to learn and like get exposure.
Wow. So you pursued your LLM at the University of Cambridge. Amazing. So which other universities did you apply to? And if you received offers from them, which I'm sure you did, what factors influenced your decision to choose Cambridge, besides the fact that it's Cambridge, obviously?
Oh, I did something that I would not recommend anyone listening or watching to this podcast do. I applied to 9 schools.
Okay.
Don't do this. And I did it on my own. I didn't take external help. It takes a lot out of you, and honestly, it doesn't increase your chances of getting in somewhere. I mean, logically, sure, yeah, but given the kind of like cost it exacts from you, the stuff that it's a bit much. So yeah, I applied to 9 schools. Let me just go from the beginning. So my top choices were Harvard, Cambridge, and Columbia.
Okay.
I was rejected from Harvard and Columbia. Columbia because I didn't have the 2 years of experience that require. Harvard because, well, I got rejected. And Cambridge was obviously the leftover top choice.
My God.
But yeah, it was a no-brainer when that's the acceptance I got first. So I was like, okay, I have to like send it, and I couldn't wait for everyone else to send me acceptances or rejections. But I did get accepted to UC Berkeley, UCLA. I think all the other schools except Oxford. I can't remember who else I applied to, but Georgetown as well. Yeah, Georgetown as well.
Wow. So besides the fact that this was obviously Cambridge, it's a top choice for many, was there any other factor that influenced your decision for picking this college specifically?
Well, yes. So Cambridge has a strong pedagogical tradition of theory. Like they're very heavy in theories, how I tell people when they ask me what my experience was like. And because I wanted to learn the law, I thought the UK schools might be a better place for me to go. And the US schools, of course, in practice, like they have a lot more to offer in practice. But I chose to apply to Cambridge because I thought their tradition of being so theoretical is super valuable,
Right. Okay. Yeah.
given learn the
Lovely.
law.
So, securing admission to such prestigious institutions requires a strong SOP and impactful LORs. How did you approach both of them, and what advice would you like to give to aspiring LLM candidates?
So the LORs are the tough part because you're dependent on someone else to get your application done.
Mhm.
And the someone else is usually super busy, obviously, because they're teachers usually and they run on their schedule, and like it's just really, really hard to follow up with them if you're planning to like get it just before the deadline. So what I'd recommend is honestly like get your letters of recommendation in order first. And in order to do that, what I did was I contacted my teachers, like, I don't know, many months in advance, 4 to 6 months in advance, I think. And I contacted multiple, like I think 3 or 4, depending on just in case. And
Right.
depending on their availability that I knew of and willingness. So, yeah, so some of them asked me to write a draft letter of recommendation that they would incorporate, or but that doesn't make you feel good. Like I
Yeah,
didn't like doing that.
exactly. How do I talk about myself in a great way?
And in fact, I also got a letter of recommendation from my boss at the time.
Right.
And, he also asked me for this draft, and I prepared one, but he never relied on it. That was the only draft that I prepared for
Right.
anybody. But he just wrote his own thing, which I was really grateful for by the end. And yeah, but it took a lot of following up. It took a lot of following up with everyone involved.
Makes sense.
So yeah, that's how I went about the LORs. The SOP, I decided I won't look at anyone's SOPs when I write my own.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I don't know if this is recommended, but when people ask for my SOP, I prefer not to share it, not because of concerns that people are going to copy my writing style or like my life story, which you can't,
Mm-hmm.
but because I'd love for people to give it a shot on their own. And this was before Chat GPT and the things that people use now to improve their applications. But yeah, I just felt like I'd rather write it in my own words and then have it reviewed by someone at my law school or someone who's been to an LLM program, who's been admitted, or even a teacher, just have it reviewed by them for consistency, format. And I'm sure they've seen SOPs. So there's no question that I'll get influenced by them if they review it in a certain way. So yeah, and I wrote several rewrites, and like it was really hard to narrow down on what exactly mattered the most to me. So in that sense, it's a lovely process for everybody applying. You really get to introspect. So, but it's also really hard to narrow down on what it is that you feel that matters, what you want to present to them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also hard not to get caught up in cliches. And for
Yeah.
instance, everyone wants to write that everyone wants a sob story, for
Yeah.
instance, like, and it's hard to be authentic. So that's something that I learned while writing the SOP, because I kept thinking about what matters to me, and I hope that went through. For instance, in Cambridge, I started with how I had a food allergy,
Okay.
and that motivated me to study IP law, because had I not had access to medication, I would have died. So that's in brief, but that's what it was about. Yeah.
So, how long did it take you to write this SOP?
That's a good question. In retrospect, I'd say I started 6 months in advance, but they were just rough outlines until maybe a month before each deadline. I think that's when I seriously put it into structures and edited and rewrote. I'd also gotten feedback at that point from people, so it was helpful too. I just said a month in, I sort of had
Okay.
final draft. I
Right.
got reviews and then I could refine them as well. Just
All right. So, the Pratibha I'm saying Cambridge Trust Scholarship, it's a highly prestigious award. So, how did receiving this scholarship shape your journey, and what factors do you think what factors contributed to your success in securing this scholarship?
So I'll take the second part of it first. I don't know what factors contributed. I do know that I had a wonderful interview with some of the best interviewers I'm fortunate to have encountered in my life. So it was a very engaging and challenging interview, but I think it definitely helped that I was interested in intellectual property law. Like I said, I still am. And I kept up with the legal news.
Right.
So I knew about a case that, a very, very big case in IP law that had something very specific and scientific involved in it. And the interviewers were happy. I could see they were happy that I knew about those things.
Right.
So that definitely helped. And having good grades, I guess, always helps. But yeah, I mean, that's something else. But once I did get the scholarship, it definitely opens doors for you because people know Justice Singh. She became a judge, I think, the year after I got
Right.
the scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
So people know Justice Singh, her contributions to Cambridge, to the legal community in India. Like it opens a lot of doors for people to know that you've received this scholarship. And they
Yeah.
all ask why, how, what were the criteria, but they all know Justice Singh. So it's a really, really big deal.
Right.
But most of all, the network that Justice Singh has created among the scholars is invaluable. The people that I've met, the other person who got the scholarship with me is a good friend. It's just, I mean, and we keep in touch
Mm-hmm.
regularly, at least a few times a year. And Justice Singh's office makes efforts to ensure that everyone is coordinated, everyone keeps in touch.
That's so nice.
So it is very nice, and a lot of them have very similar interests to me. So it's always good to have seniors as well as juniors whom you can reach out to. I mean, it's a smaller network than your law school network, but I find it to be invaluable. They're
Wow.
all great people.
That's amazing. That's a really good way to go about building a network, having that connection. That's amazing to know. So you've had the privilege of experiencing the best of both worlds here in India as well as in the UK. How would you compare the academic environments, the teaching style, cultural diversity, or your overall experience at these prestigious institutions?
So I don't know how much is a factor of the level that each institution occupies in their respective countries or their respective university rankings or whatever, but I had the opportunity to experience very good education in both these places. That's what I found in common. There are people who are motivated and dedicated, and I don't mean the students, I mean the teachers. Like they really, really want you to see a new side of the world that you haven't before. Um, so that's what I found in common at both these institutions. And of course, the student body and the alumni network is prolific. Like it's great to be a part of these institutions because you have supportive seniors, you have good juniors, and yeah, you just have so much common ground with so many cool people around the world. So that's something that they have in common. But in terms of difference, I'd say actually I found NLS education at the time. I mean, things have changed a lot because we have different teachers, we have different management now. But at the time, I found NLS to be more traditional in terms of what it teaches and the kinds of cases that it goes back to. For example, in tort law or something like that, or ethics, like things are very set in stone and traditional. Whereas in Cambridge, although they focus on theory, there is a pull towards understanding everything from a global perspective. And it's not just because I took courses on comparative law, but we had a teacher for IP law, for example, that made sure to make us understand the perspectives that people bring to a particular IP issue when they're from different parts of the world. Like if it's Brazil and India, how is it different? Which I really appreciated because the class was not full of people from Brazil and India and those kinds of countries.
Right.
So yeah, and teachers made like a sustained effort to step out of the molds of like conventional ways of teaching. Like even in family law, sure, there were cases, but cases were contrasted against others. And I thought it was more lively overall, although I did have teachers like that at NLS, but or maybe because my LLM program was shorter, but
Right.
I feel like there was a more global perspective to everything. And
Right. It was a more practical way of learning, would you say?
oh, well, not quite. No, we didn't have very many case studies. I mean, case studies, sure, but we didn't have anything that we had to practically enact or, put ourselves in the position of
Yeah.
or exercises. Like, there's no like practical reenactment of
Right.
things, and that's it.
Yeah.
But it forced you to think.
So, after completing your LLM in Cambridge, did you consider exploring the job market in the UK, or was returning to India always part of the plan?
Returning to India was very much part of the plan. I did not want to do anything else, so I buried my head in the sand and was like, I'm coming back.
Yeah.
So yeah, I wanted to litigate because I felt like without exploring the litigation world, I won't know whether I want to do this forever as a career, and I need to start now because it, like, for me, every second mattered at the time. I was like, I really, really need to know what it's like to be a litigation lawyer, and I have to start soon. And litigation comes with a context. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know if you've interned at
Yeah, I've done a bunch
place.
of jobs. Yeah.
Yeah. So litigation comes with a context, like you need to know how society works and
Exactly.
how women are treated, for instance, in a domestic violence case, to know why the law is like that. But it'll take forever to learn that context in the UK perspective, which is why I decided maybe it's not for me at this stage in my life. So yeah, I very much just wanted to come back.
Wow, you're very sure of that decision, and that's really, really good. So far we've known about your journey in India and in the UK. So your admission to the State Bar of California is quite an impressive addition to your profile. What inspired you to pursue this particular qualification? How does it align with your career goals?
So the main reason, simple reason that I took the bar exam was because my sister lives in California. And my younger sister, we are very close. And she studied at UC Berkeley and she's been there forever. So I thought a good way to make sure that we visit her more often is to have me have a professional connection to the state. So, which is why I gave it a thought. But at the same time, I was very taken by this whole Gen AI boom because while AI has been around for donkey's years before that, like this really made me think of questions of ethics and reading about the New York Times suit against OpenAI and
Yeah,
things like that. Like it made me think about copyright a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I used to code as a kid and I was very interested in emerging technologies. So I thought, maybe it's time for a change to something that's new and upcoming in this like world, because litigation will be there for you whenever you want to come back, if at all, and it's fairly set in its ways. And I felt like I had learned all that I wanted to from litigation and that I wanted to maybe do something different. Like I didn't want to litigate in the state of California, but I wanted to do something different, and
Got it.
this was a good way to do it. And my sister was there, so I was like, yeah, let's
Do
explore
both of
something
those.
new.
Yeah. Wow. So you've talked about AI data protection and Gen AI, it's a very booming field. So what sparked your interest in this particular field, and how did you cultivate your expertise in such a, well, very rapidly evolving field?
So about getting interested, it's really again because of the news. I have the news to blame for a lot of my life decisions. But after realizing the potential of Gen AI, I got more invested in reading about how AI works and different models work. And it's something that's not hard to understand because I was from a science background. It's something that fascinated me very much because now something can write your code for you. That's just next level. I was like, wow, this is so fascinating. So that's really how I got into it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as to the second part of your question, nobody is an expert in these fields. It's the thing is that these things are so rapidly changing that no one person can claim that they know all that there is to know about this, if that makes sense.
Right.
So yeah, but all you can do is stay on top of it and again read the news and figure out how things work, where things are going, where they have been in the past, which helps us understand what our ethical and legal concerns are, and just be steeped in it as much as you can, which is also why I signed up for this AIGP certification that this body called the IAPP offers.
Right.
I thought I thought it would be something that I would learn from again. I wasn't expecting to pass it because it was the first certification ever offered in the world, but it really did help me learn. And in that sense, I achieved my objective, even though I did pass. I learned a lot about like different kinds of models, what deep learning is, and all that sort of stuff. Like the technical stuff to do with AI, I managed to learn, as well as the ethical concerns and how to govern systems that use, deploy AI, those sorts of things. That gave me a foundation, really. So if you look for a foundation, you can start cultivating the expertise.
Right. So you are a member of organizations like Women Defining AI, Responsible AI Institute, and International Association of Privacy Professionals. Can you share what these organizations do and what your nature of involvement with these organizations are?
Sure. So broadly, one purpose unites all of them, bringing together people in the same field, be it AI, be it privacy. So the IAPP is way, way bigger. It's not just an affinity group or something like that. It offers courses. I'm sure you've heard or like
I have,
you will
yes.
hear. So they offered this AIGP course that I did, and you have to pay for membership. You have to, but it opens the doors to like a huge community around the world of privacy professionals, people adjacent to that. Even it's pretty cool. So I'm just a member of the IAPP. I'm not advising or organizing, but it has opened so many doors for me in terms of an emerging privacy professional. So I would highly recommend anyone looking to be a member, to be a student member, maybe. I think that's an option as well. You can volunteer for the events and things like that, to organize them, sorry, because we have presence in India as well for like people who are actually organizing events in India. So that's something that's good for emerging privacy professionals to know. I mean, like, even if they're students, it's good to know you can get involved with their work. As for the other two, to me, they have had the value of being networking communities because they organize teaching sessions, webinars, send news updates. And especially Women Defining AI so far has been, I mean, it has brought me close to a community of people, women and non-binary persons who are working in the field. A lot of people who do things with AI that I'd never know of unless if I hadn't joined this group, I'd never know that they use AI in this way or they use Gen AI in this way. Like, it's just very cool. So again, it brings you in touch with a community of people, and a lot of people are part of the Responsible AI Institute as well. So it's always good to connect with them on LinkedIn and have a chat and, speak about where their professional lives are going, really. So it has a lot of networking advantages.
That is great. That's great. So, one thing that also stood out to me is you have a working proficiency in French and Spanish, along with a solid foundation in other Indian languages as well. What motivated you to learn these languages, and does being multilingual have the potential of enriching one's professional journey?
So, first of all, I'd like to start off with prefacing that I don't speak Spanish. Like, I've just done a 3-month course in it.
Right.
I'm trying to understand. It's my husband, he's good at Spanish. So, because of him, I decided I'll start picking it up. But French is a different story. I picked it up as an adult learner when I was studying in France, and it changed my mind in ways that I can't describe. Like, it just felt like I was I was grasping at something I didn't have to try and convey what I wanted to say. And that feeling is so, like, it's beautiful, but it leaves something in you at the same time. So I can't articulate why, but I decided to start learning French after I came back from France. I did a semester there. And I grew up speaking English, Hindi, and Marathi, which is because I'm from Mumbai. But French was a different story. I just picked it up as a hobby, and today I'm fluent in it, like business school
Wow.
level. It just happened. Like,
That's amazing.
I don't know, like, it's just a thing that happened because it just kept going on no matter what my life circumstances were, whether I was in litigation or not, whether I was in law school or not. French just kept going on. So,
Beautiful. Deviating a little bit from the question, is there any particular sentence or word that you like in French that is one of your favorites?
well, yes, they're quite simple actually. So there's this word called s'épanouir, which means to blossom, to grow, which I feel has been meaningful for me as someone transitioning from I don't know, litigation to privacy law. Like, those are very different things. And there's another one that's kind of simple that I say to myself sometimes. Je m'assume, or like, it just means that I've got this, like,
Wow.
I can do this.
Self-assurance.
Yeah, otherwise there are many more beautiful quotes in
Right.
French. I'm sure the internet
It's
is
a
full
beautiful
of them.
language. It's a beautiful language.
It's a beautiful language, but like There's another one, I don't know if this one you must have heard of. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Like it means the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Wow, that's a beautiful
Which is,
sentence. That's amazing.
that's a common one. But like the ones I said before are the ones that I use the most in my life. So
French
like
is
I
a
think about it.
language. It's quite intriguing. I definitely would want to try to learn it somewhere. My brother learned it for like about 1.5 years, but he wasn't much of a fan. But it seems like quite an interesting language. Very intriguing, I would say.
It again in terms of opening doors, it gives you access to a lot of literature, a lot of media that would kind of be lost in translation if you just looked at
Exactly.
the subtitles. I mean, those little nuances are worth everything. Like all of the learning verbs and learning conjunctions and like all of those conjugations and things like that. Yeah, like learning. Now we're off the training wheel, so we don't use them. Like we don't learn them in tables that much. But yeah, it just like makes you appreciative of a whole new way of living, and like it's not just France. It's like all the places they had colonized
Yeah.
and the people that speak French. Like there's so much that you learn about the world.
Right. So, going back to the questionnaire, you've shared your thoughts on the privilege and challenges of being an NLU graduate, including the stereotypes that are associated. How do you believe this perception affects graduates, and what would you advise young law students to focus on breaking these stereotypes?
Okay, so about the stereotypes, I mean, its roots are not unfounded because back when I was in law school and there used to be sports festivals, people used to chant, like people from my college used to chant, and so did I because I didn't know any better.
Right.
They're like, oh, office mein tera baap on law school, and we are law school, for like we used to
Exactly.
be law school, like that's like the law school.
Right.
So now initially, like that's the mindset that you come into, and that you feel like, oh, I'm at the top of the world. I'm at the National Law School, Bangalore, and like I'm the best, and that's what you come into as well. So you don't realize that that's not what the real world is.
True.
So that's where that feeling of superiority is rooted, but you come back very quickly to the ground once you start looking at your papers and like looking at comparing opportunities that other people get, and like how well they do doesn't depend on which law school you went to. Like that's just a fact of life. Like sure, it gives you some opportunities, it gives you many opportunities because people can stereotype you as being really really good because you're from one of the top law schools. So yeah, so you get automatic preference in some things. But I know most people have surmounted that to like demonstrate what they're made of independently of where they came from. And I mean, like schools that you would call random, from random parts of the country that you'd never heard of unless you met that person, and like they're doing great things, they're happy with what they're doing, and I think that's what matters, right? At the end of the day, you're happy with what you're doing.
Yeah, very true.
So this is something that you come to realize after your first year in law school, at least if you're from NLS or but yeah, and especially as you go into the working world. And unfortunately, there is a stereotype against NLU people. It's not just NLS people, but that they're very arrogant and they
Very
don't really want to
entitled.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So someone thought I was arrogant and entitled and refused to give me an internship until I just really asked for an internship. And I was like, no, please, please. Like that person knew my parents as well. So they finally gave an internship because they knew my parents.
Oh.
And but then by the end of it, they were just like, I was wrong about, like they expressly said, I was wrong about NLU students. It's not everyone is like that. So I just wondered what NLU students had come to these people, if option of NLU students that
Yeah.
they see, because I don't know, like it's hard when you come, like as an NLU person, you come with preconceived notions, and then other people develop these preconceived notions about you, and then future NLU students are subjected to this, and then now we think everybody makes stereotypes about us. So it's just a vicious circle. But
Yeah.
honestly, the advice that I would give to people, whether in NLUs or not, is to keep an open mind, because the people that are interning with you today, who knows where they're going to be tomorrow? Like, if you like them as people, don't let your perceptions of how they got into law school or where they got into law school influence what you think of them, because people are not to be judged by which law school they go to. It's
Very
not
true.
something that, yeah, whether you're from NLS or you're from some college in a very small town in India. Like,
It doesn't
I
matter.
mean,
Yeah. A person from,
yeah,
let's say, a non-government college or private college could also be very entitled and arrogant. An NLU student could also be entitled and arrogant. But that's the person. It's not the college that they're representing.
yeah, I agree with you. That's the person, and it's very hard to separate that. I understand because many of them come from colleges where like this office mein tera baap culture is encouraged. So maybe
Mhm.
when they're younger, they don't have an understanding that their co-interns are just as smart or just as worthy of being people as them
Right.
at the
Right.
very least.
Yeah, very true.
So yeah, I mean, and some people never grow out of it, unfortunately.
Well,
But
that's the mindset.
that's on them. It's a personality thing. So I just hope that any students listening to this keep an open mind, because you never know. You never know what somebody's capable of, or like, I don't know, like it's just
That's very true.
yeah, it's just keep an open.
Very true, very true. So as we reach our last few questions, you have been reviewing LLM application drafts for prospective Cambridge applicants. What inspired you to take up this mentorship initiative, and what common mistakes or areas of improvements have you observed in the applications?
So what inspired me was that I have had very good mentors in life, and I feel like because of this stereotype or this preference, automatic preference that NLU students get or the more visible students get, a lot of people fall behind and won't have access to mentors the way I did.
Right.
So, my first boss, he's no more, unfortunately. He was a judge of the Supreme Court, and he was the best mentor a person could ever have. And he's the reason that I want to pass it on, carry it forward, do something for the people that come after me, because it's the ways in which it can change your character is astounding. Just having someone to sound ideas off of, to tell you that, oh, this is maybe not the right way, you should do it,
Yeah.
do this instead. Like, if you just have someone that can do something with their life experience for you, so that you have a better shot of getting into these universities that people don't have the privilege to get into, either because of whatever financial setbacks, like social setbacks, like things like that that affect how good you are with the English language also. Like, if I could just help people in some way overcome those, like, I don't know, those setbacks, it would just mean the world to me and the memory of my boss. So that's why I started, because that's one small way I can help right now.
Right.
But going forward, of course, I'd love to extend it to, I don't know, something more formal, something monetary. But right now, this is the best I can do. So
Yeah.
that's what I do. But in terms of common errors that I see, or common things that might set an application back, I'd say there are these cliched phrases. I don't know where they come from. Like,
Yeah.
it's just like, oh, being like, I don't know, like a girl child from India or something like that. Like, not even like village or,
Yeah.
yeah. So it is patriarchal, yes, but you need to explain how that impacted your
Exactly.
education,
Yeah.
how that impacted your perception, your skill to just say those things. And also to start with, oh, my love for the law, like, you have to go beyond your love for the law. You have to explain why you love the law and why it's relevant to, like, basically make those connections. Like, why is it relevant to going to graduate school, for example? Why do you want to go abroad? So the lack of connection, and then I'm thinking of, like, I don't know where people get those stereotypical phrases from. I'm thinking, oh yeah, that global advantage, global perspective, world class
Right.
perspective, something like that. But what perspective? Like, so those cliches need to be circumvented. You need to, yes, you are going there for a global perspective, but everyone who's writing that essay is going to say global perspective. So you need to be clearer in terms of the cliched phrases that you use. A global perspective on what? So,
Right.
for example, if you're going there to study like private law or advanced global perspective on contracts, like what specifically? Like, this part of like contract law is looked at differently here. This is what it is like here. So, or I want to go to study the GDPR, the UK GDPR, whatever it is. Like,
Right.
it's good to connect it to your ultimate objective, because everyone is going to say global perspective. Everyone is going to say
Very generic.
the law. Yeah. So I don't know how much of this can be attributed to Chat GPT, because I know people use it to make their essays better, which is good. But I don't know, like, a lot of phrases keep repeating themselves because we use AI to polish things that we write these
Right.
days. Or maybe people just want to say the same things that their seniors did. I
That
don't know what it is.
is true.
That's something that I would advise people avoid at all costs. Think about what it is that they want to say and say it differently, like connect it to your personal story.
Wow.
Yeah.
So this brings us to our last and final question. Based on your experience mentoring applicants, what final advice would you like to give to students who are aspiring to study at institutions like Cambridge, especially when navigating the challenges of, such competitive applications and
Well, to everyone that's looking to apply for a master's, I'd say think about, have your life goals clear, but just remember that you can't plan everything.
Very true.
This is contrary to what a lot of people say, that you have to have your goals clear, you have to do this, and you have to work with an attorney, you have to do that. But you never know where you're going to be 5 years down the line. So all you know is that you want to do this master's program, you want to do it in a certain part of the world, if not in India. You just go for it. Just make sure to put funding in place as much as you can. It's because the scholarships world out there is difficult to navigate if you don't have access to the things that kids from NLUs do, because their seniors often avail of these scholarships. So get your funding in order as soon as you can. Find, I don't know, I hope that you find whatever way it is to fund. But yeah, my advice would be to just know that the LLM is not the end of the world. And if you don't get into the school you want, it's not the end of the world. You can apply again. You can do so many other things in place of your LLM and then do it again somewhere else. It's the world is your oyster. It's not the end of the world. Like, just do, and you have a life ahead of you. So look forward to living that.
That's very true. That's something that people really need to keep in mind. Life is what happens when you're making plans. So I think that's some great advice. And well, that brings us to the end of this podcast. It was so amazing having you on here. The realistic advice that you gave, topics, the passion I can see it's shining through you, and it's so inspiring and motivating to me, to say the least. And I'm sure the listeners will also find it absolutely amazing. It's been amazing talking to you.
Thank you very much, Ria. Thank you for having me on this podcast. And it was a pleasure getting to speak with you. And yeah, hope to remain in touch. And
100%,
I hope Project
100%.
LLM reaches height after height.
Thank you so much. And to our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope you found today's episode as inspiring as I did. So that's it from our side. Thank you so much, and bye bye.